Hello and welcome to the second episode of my new podcast for Whole Reason, where our goal is to find where faith meets reason, where Christianity becomes thoughtful rather than just an appeal to authority. And I'm so glad to be back. I had to skip a week last Saturday, because my mom's in the hospital, aging parents, all that stuff. But I'm here trying to create something consistent and trying to create a community where thinking Christians can avoid the traps of unthinking faith. And also where skeptics can come and maybe gain a respect for thinking faith. Now, with all that in mind, let's see if I can share the doodad. No, that's too small. Make it bigger. There we go. So last week we talked about epistemology in general, and we're going to review what we talked about. But today I want to talk about the limits of empiricism, or the limits of science. Science tells us a lot about the natural world, the physical, material world, but it has some limitations, and a lot of people have trouble negotiating what those limitations are. What can science not tell us? For instance, can it help us prioritize our morals or our ethics? Can it tell us that humans have basic rights? Can it tell us whether or not God exists? Those are the questions we want to think through today. And I want to ask the question, how do we apply observation in our search for truth? All right. Let's see if I can make this slide move forward. All right, well, here's an overview. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to just give you a glorified kind of PowerPoint presentation, but PowerPoint's very helpful. Oh, there we go. Now I'm bigger. I kind of like that. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about last week's feedback. Here's our where we're going. I'm going to talk about today's topic, which is the limits of science. Again, I'll mention a book of the week. Last week's book, I'm not too crazy about. I probably should have thought about that one more, but don't worry, we're moving forward. And I'm going to have as well a closing prayer, and I've added a new segment this week, and that segment is Confessions of a Podcaster. For those of you who, like me, wish you had your own channel, have something you think you want to say, man, is it not easy. And so I know that's not really germane to the subject, but you could stop right there, and I'm going to share with you my current process, where I'm at, how the struggles are, just so you can also get up and get moving in your thing. All right, so here we go. All right, well, my first question, before I review what happens last week, I need a compelling tagline, a compelling, when I come in, I have to say something that kind of captures what I'm doing here. And I haven't figured that out yet. So right now, it just says, what does it say? Thoughtful Christianity. That's kind of like the tag on my website. And that's all right, but it doesn't really say what we're doing here. So I have some other suggestions, and I would love it if you would put some suggestions in there. I'm sure I'll get some jokes rather than just serious ones. That's okay, especially if I have some of my skeptic friends here. I've thought about faith seeking understanding. That's Anselm's kind of view that that faith, when faith moves forward and it's seeking to understand, but not before believing. You can believe before you understand. You can trust before you understand, but understanding does need to catch up. And in fact, with that in mind, I've coined this phrase. I don't know if I made it up, if I read somewhere, but I can never find any original quote. So let me know. And that is, before faith comes, reason is king. After faith comes, reason is servant. Now, I know my skeptic friends will not like that. And it's got some qualifications. When faith and reason disagree, or faith and science disagree, it's not that science is always wrong. Sometimes my comprehension of faith is wrong. So when there's a challenge there, we need to resolve it properly and look for the truth, rather than just resolving to either go with reason or with faith, because either one of them can actually be wrong. All right, well, how about this one? Reason is the devil's whore. You know what? With all of Martin Luther's imperfections, his boldness is a little fun. Now, we'll talk about this more in the future, because I love this topic. But basically, Luther wasn't saying that we shouldn't trust reason, but that reason apart from God is just a way for people will use to disavow God and to we'll use our reason against God often. And so he was saying, people can convince themselves of anything when their reason is disconnected from God. They can even convince themselves that certain races are inferior or things like that. All right. So when it comes to morals, with some of the worst moral and ethical breaches we've seen in history belong to atheist regimes. Certainly Christians have done things wrong, but in violation of their principles rather than in the vacuum of morality that atheism creates. And we'll talk more about atheism and science and the pretensions of atheism, but not today. All right. Well, how about, let's see, developing spiritually and intellectually mature Christianity. That is my goal here. In fact, here, I'll be right back. Told you I'll be right back. By the way, my green screen is getting repaired, and I should have one next week so you don't see all this weird stuff behind my head. Whatever. So I was writing in my journal today, my nice $1 composition book. Love this thing. And I was trying to write down what I'm trying to do here. Now, where is the last page? Right. Why don't we just go to the end? Okay. So here's what I wrote that I want to do. And from this, I'm trying to get a decent tagline. I love the church and its members, and I'm attempting to bring the spiritual and intellectual. I'm trying to develop them into spiritual and intellectual maturity, to train the heart and mind. Some people are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. The untrained mind can be tricked by vain philosophies. Now, we may feel secure. We may feel insecure when smart people challenge us about the scriptures or science, and we need to address that and give people confidence that they have the intellectual strength and disciplines to be able to withstand what are often foolish and unreasonable challenges. All right. So, and all of that is in order for us to pursue our callings. So, without any further ado, if you can give me a decent tagline, besides reason is the devil's whore, I can probably improve. All right, here we go. So I just want to review what we did last week. Last week, we talked about that empiricism. I wanted to find these 4 epistemological methods. That is the 4 methods that we use to discern truth. So the first at the top of the pyramid here, and by the way, we can turn this pyramid depending on what we are trying to accomplish. So for science, empiricism is king, and then we also reference authorities like previous scientific work. We use reason, and we use our experience to help us keep our empiricism on track, right? Because even empiricism needs reasonable assumptions. So reason is definitely involved. Now, empiricism is used to explore physical reality, material reality through observation and experimentation. Can you see my mouse? Yeah, so there's empiricism. Now, that is normally what we do in science, although there is some discussion in science about the difference between naturalism and materialism, and it's a little complicated. But it does have limits. So the question is what are the limits of what science can tell us? Well, we're going to talk about that today. But let's talk about reason. So reason is another method that we have available to us, right? It's applied to things that cannot be directly observed, but conclusions can be found using inductive reasoning or abduction from the evidence that we do have. So for instance, when it comes to history, we can't observe or go back and watch history in real time, right? We can't run experiments, for instance, to see if direct experiments that we can observe to see if, for instance, George Washington had wooden false teeth. Now, that doesn't mean we can't get a reasonable guess at that, right? So, for instance, did creatures evolve from a single ancestor? Well, we're trying to prove that with science, but we didn't see it happen. So we have to make some assumptions and look at the historical data. Remember, history uses reason to interpret the data rather than observe processes in real time. So, for instance, abiogenesis has never been observed. We've never seen life spring from non-life. We're trying to do it in the labs, so we are employing empiricism. But as far as going back and watching that original event to prove that it happened, not really. In fact, Richard Dawkins once famously said that evolution is true even though we can't observe it. So that's an interesting perspective, and I kind of agree with him, at least in the fact that it cannot be observed in real time. And even the experiments that we can do are inconclusive at best. And we'll talk about that in the future. So these are some of the things that reason is used for when we're talking about historical realities. We're talking about non-material philosophical realities, like what is moral, what is good, is there a God, what is God like? Unfortunately, empiricism is super limited and has to take a back seat to these other methods. Now, it doesn't mean we don't use empiricism to school us. It means, though, however, that reason, authority, and experience are going to probably take some precedence over empiricism. And I know that's the rub with a lot of people who are atheist or who don't want to examine truth outside of what they can directly experience or test. Now let's go talk about the third one. Experience is our subjective experience of the real world. And the primary functions of our innards here, our heart, our mind, is the exercise of our intuition and our conscience. Remember, our intuition is the feeling of this is true. Things are falling together. I don't understand why, but I believe it's true. Conscience is with regard to good or bad, good or evil. So we'll continue to talk about that in the future. But we certainly need our intuitions. So, for instance, when the American founders said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. What they were saying there is we hold these truths to be true by intuition and conscience, even if we can't prove these more objective morals with empiricism, they are true to those whose intuition and conscience are properly functioning, as well as their reason. Now, the one piece of feedback I got last week was from the Unbelievable Facebook group. And one of the moderators there, who I really like, even though he's an atheist, fed back, and he basically does not like this approach. And one of the things he said is that my podcast feels more like apologetics than pure philosophy. And I have to agree with him. I am doing like Christian philosophy, but I'm not really doing apologetics, so I'm sure that comes in it. And I do think that this, what they call this epistemological tetrahedron, I'm sorry, I do love big words. Anyway, is really useful. It's a pretty common model, although there are like 10 different ways to model epistemology, including the virtue method and a bunch of others. But I like this one for its simplicity and its kind of hierarchy. So, for instance, if you list these in order of decreasing subjectivity, right? So the most objective, the most one that's easily the most confirmable by other people is empiricism. I can run an experiment and I can make conclusions, and then you can test that by running the experiment yourself and seeing if it's reproducible, right? With empiricism, I can say, if this exists, I can falsify it and say, if this exists, then my hypothesis is false. That is not something you can do with reason, experience, and authority necessarily. And that's kind of what distinguishes science as being kind of very objective and testable. Now, some people want to stop there in their search for truth and say, this is the only way we can know what is true. That's called scientism. We'll talk about that today. But, where was I? Oh, anyway, my friend fed back and said that, he didn't like the fact that I was talking about that those who deny, for instance, the objective human rights are considered dysfunctional, that their reason is not working properly, and that their intuition and conscience is not working properly. And we'll talk about that in the future, but I believe that is exactly what the American founders were implying, that if you don't recognize objective human rights, something wrong with your reasoning, or there's something wrong with your intuition and conscience. And I would go on to say, in that phrase, it goes that these rights come from or are grounded in the existence of a creator God. And whether or not they meant that was also self-evident is an open question. But I would say the Bible does teach that it is self-evident that a creator exists. Not necessarily the Christian God, but the creator. And that if our intuition and conscience are suppressed, Though we know that that is true, and when we look at creation, we know that it is self-evident that God exists, and that if we deny that, then there's something in our reasoning or something in our conscience or intuition that are damaged. And we all are damaged in this world, which teaches things opposite of what a spiritual approach to life would look like, and we are all injured by death and all kind of other things that come into our lives. But anyway, so that's a review of where we've been. We've got these 4 methods: empiricism, reason, experience, and authority. And remember, authority is just what our elders said. Maybe it's the wisdom of the past decades. Maybe it's what science has said so far. It's what the Bible says. We look at revealed sources, but that doesn't mean those things are true. It doesn't mean that what's in the Quran or the Bible or even published by the IPCC is true, even though it is an authoritative source. It just means that that's one of our sources, and it too must be supplemented with reason, experience, and empiricism when necessary. And so that's the rubric that I want us to grasp as thinking Christians, is that there's more than one way to figure out what is true, and we shouldn't limit ourselves to science like many scientism adherents do. All right, well, when we talk about what's the difference between science and non-science, pseudoscience, or other methods of knowing, this is commonly known as the demarcation problem. How do you demarcate where science ends and these other methods, which are less reliable perhaps, begin? Maybe they're totally unreliable and we should ignore them. Some people think. So here's a definition I took from Wikipedia. In philosophy of science and epistemology, that's what we're talking about, the demarcation problem is the question of how to distinguish between science and non-science. It also examines the boundaries between science, pseudoscience, and other products of human activity like art, literature, and beliefs. And I would also say history. So let's figure out what the limits are of science so we know how to use science properly and how to put it in its place when we're talking about the reality of non-material realities like God and objective morals. All right. Well, here's one of the most famous philosophers of science, Karl Popper, who died in 1994. I wish I would have seen him before he passed, but I did not. But we can find him on the interwebs. And this is a really good quote from one of the many quotes he's talked about here in The Limits of Science. And he said, insofar as scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. So he set this very strict limit, which is, if it's not falsifiable, if you can't tell me the conditions, testable conditions that would falsify your viewpoint, then your viewpoint is not accurate. Excuse me. Oh, here it is. I know I had one of these. I left it in the kitchen. Well, that unfortunately is not the end of the discussion. It's very controversial about, is that too strict a limit? Does that, and we're not going to go into that today, but let me just say that there are many others who have taken issue with this definition, including the great philosophers like Thomas Kuhn, D.C. Stove, Paul Thagard, and many others. And I will provide a link in the description after we're done recording to a nice paper that discusses briefly the responses to Popper. All right. Cheers. You see, I don't talk enough, although my friends would disagree. Well, here's another book that I reviewed, and I'll post a link to this review. This is Huston Smith's Why Religion Matters. And he talks about why reality goes beyond what science can describe. His writing is winsome and conversational, self-effacing, and he wanders a bit in his discussions. He's obviously supremely well-read and quotes every theologian and philosopher from Anselm to Zarathustra. And he incorporates not only important literature, but current and historical events, but sometimes he goes off on these relevant things, and I lose track of where he's going. But he had a nice model which simply describes the limits of science. And here it is. Science describes the physical universe, but religion, and I would add philosophy. Remember, theology Theology is the study of what your book says, your Bible says, your religion says, and it is true. Philosophy goes beyond that, and science uh, is a little bit beyond that as well. So what he would say is that all of reality is within the big circle, and science can only describe the physical universe. And I think that's a helpful, if not simplistic, view. Well, let's talk about this thing called scientism, the limitation that empiricism is the only way to know what is true. I just want to provide a couple quotes on this to get a taste of it, because I think that is a really limited way to live. In fact, I've called it a fearful way to live. And here's what I mean by that. You know, science has had such success up until recently, you know, modern science, that the good thing is that superstition and false beliefs have been dealt with. But some people think that all religious claims, all moral claims are now basically useless because science can tell us everything. And that is the mistake. And scientism is the kind of ism that represents that mistake. And one of the reasons I call that fearful is because we know that the farther down you go that chain, like reason has some level of subjectivity, right? It's based on reasonable assumptions, but people can disagree that your reasoning is not good enough. So for instance, in modern geological science, they assume a uniformitarianism, that all the processes that we see today, whether it's erosion or radioactive decay or tectonic plate movement, is pretty much uniform, that there are no cataclysms, there are no big changes, there are no big interruptions. Well, is that a good assumption? See, even in science, when you get to the assumptions and reason, you can start becoming less sure, right? It's an argument now of probabilities, which of course all of science really is anyway. So, but let's say we're using reason. Well, what now if we're moving to experience? Well, experience is even more subjective. It's like, I feel, I experienced, I interpreted reality the way this way. Well, a lot of people don't, maybe I can use that to say what's true for me, but I can't use that to say what's true for you. Or can I? Can I use that information to say we hold these truths to be self-evident? That's the question. All right, so let's look at some critiques of scientism so that you know that it's not necessarily always right. Okay, pull the switch. That didn't work. Okay, pull the switch again. There we go. This is a quote from John Michael Greer. Science, at its core, is simply a method of practical logic that tests hypotheses against experience, or what he would call observable data, what I would call it. Scientism, by contrast, is the worldview and value system. It's not just a worldview, it's a value system that says what is valuable, that insists that the question of scientific method can answer the most important questions human being ask, and that the picture of this world yielded by science is a better approximation of reality than any other. Now, I will remind you that 100 years ago or less, science taught that some races were superior to others, and that we should use eugenics and kill off the genetically weak to improve humanity. Is that the best approximation of how reality works and what we should do? Not necessarily. All right, let's look at another quote that's critical of scientism. The public has a distorted view of science because children are taught in school that science is a collection of firmly established truths. In fact, science is not a collection of truths. It is a continuing exploration of mysteries. Freeman Dyson. When I first became a Christian in college, I was a biochemistry major. And I remember a lot of Christians telling me evolution was not true. Now, I had been schooled, I had been educated, I had been indoctrinated in evolution ever since I could remember being in the sciences. So I thought they were a little kooky. But as I started looking into it, I realized that I had been told that evolution was a fact, that it was true, rather than teaching how to think of being critical of it and thinking of here are the current challenges to evolutionary theory. Now, a lot of skeptics and atheists will say, well, the challenges are superficial. Underneath, it's been proven. These are just refinements. But actually, that's not really so. We'll talk about that in the future, because the real question is how poorly does a model have to incorporate existing data and predict before we realize that the model itself might really be at fault? And I would propose that the evolutionary model is seriously flawed and needs to be discarded and rebuilt in some way or others. And I'm not the only one who argues that. There's a lot of scientists who are calling for a new synthesis, because the existing one, even though we're taking into account DNA, does not answer the big problems that evolution cannot solve. All right. But I really realized that I had been taught what to think and not how to think. And as soon as I realized that it wasn't the evolutionary, it was true, it might be likely, but there are some serious challenges that may undermine the whole thing. And once the rocks were thrown in the gears for me, I thought, whoa, wait a minute. Are you telling me that the Bible story of creation, that things were created perfectly and have degraded over time instead of having improved over time, may be true, possibly scientifically true? All right, let's look at this last quote, and this is going to take us to our penultimate slide or so. It is this claim to a monopoly of meaning rather than any special scientific doctrine that makes science and religion look like competitors today. Scientism emerged not as the conclusion of scientific argument, but as a chosen element in a worldview. We chose this one portion of epistemology to make it everything. A vision that attracted people by its contrast with what went before, which is, of course, how people very often do make decisions, even ones that they afterward call scientific. Well, what went before? What is she talking about? Well, it's what we alluded to, is that before modern science, everything, the sciences were mixed. Astrology and astronomy were together. Alchemy and chemistry, there was no real separation of these preformed ideas and what we observed. We tried to fit what we observed into what the authorities told us was the structure of the universe, and that wasn't always true. And so here's the man who basically is credited with being really influential in creating modern science. This is the deist. He wasn't a Christian, but he had a strong respect for God. And here's what he wrote regarding this. This is Francis Bacon. If a man will begin with certainties, for instance, Plato's certainties that there was these perfect forms, and then what we see here are instantiations of those forms which are imperfect, or the Bible says that the earth and everything was created in 7 days. If we begin with these certainties, we will end in doubts. Why? Because we haven't tested them or proven them to be true at all, and sometimes they don't fit the facts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he will end in certainties. So, hold on for a second. What he was saying here is that we can't start with a model and try to fit our facts in. We need to look and make observations and build our models from what we observe. Now, those models by necessity will be imperfect, if not really bad, until we gather enough data. But why do we trust what the authorities from the past told us? It's not that we don't listen to them, but we don't try to fit everything into what they told us. That's not science. And that is really what sets science free from the past. And we're going to go through an example. So you'll have to excuse the crudity of my model coming up. But I wanted to use an example to show us how science was limited by prior assumptions and how it finally resolved with real science. So I'm going to minimize my picture a little bit, and I want to show you this slide. So we all kind of are familiar with the story of heliocentrism. That is, in a certain point in history, science and perhaps religion taught that the Earth was the center of our solar system. But these four gentlemen, progressively over time, proved that the sun was the center of our solar system. But that progressed in stages. And as we see these stages, I want us to see how science disengaged us from prior assumptions, and how those prior assumptions were leading us astray, and how bad assumptions, even in modern science, can lead us astray. All right, so here's our friend Nicholas Copernicus. Now, I want to create a timeline. Here's a timeline. I'm sorry that's really small, but I want you to see how these guys' lives overlap. So Copernicus was earliest in the timeline. And then you can see Kepler and Galileo had a strong overlap, although I'm putting them in a sequence here of how they discovered things. And then finally, Newton at the end. So how did science progress? And as our epistemology, as we detached from the authorities of the past, whether it's the Bible or Plato, right? How did that really happen? Well, let's talk about each one of these guys quickly. So this is Copernicus's drawing of the universe. Now, what you'll note about this is that all of the orbits are circular. Now, this assumption hindered the understanding of the planets for a long time. So he developed this model suggesting that the Earth and other planets revolve around the sun. And in his work, I'm going to say this wrong, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the revolution of the celestial spheres, laid the foundation for the heliocentric view. And what he learned was that he challenged the geocentric model that had dominated for centuries. This model, which was based on some assumptions about the perfection of creation. Plato said we have these perfect forms. Ptolemy said that I believe if God was perfect, he would create perfect circular orbits because the circle was the perfect form. And of course, it wasn't true, but many people were caught in this view for a long time. Well, then here comes Galileo. Now, we all know the story of Galileo, or we think we know it, right? Galileo wasn't killed at the stake by the Catholic Church. His work was financed by the Jesuits, by the Catholics. And when he said he was going to publish this, they said, you need to gather more data first. And instead, he was impatient. He published them. And at the same time, he called the Pope an idiot. So no wonder he was put under house arrest for the rest of his life. But he lived in his own house. He was not persecuted. And in that sense, he wasn't tortured or put to the stake. But anyway, he made significant observations using a telescope. He observed the moons around Jupiter, the phases of Venus, sunspots, irregular surface of the moon, a bunch of cool stuff. And what he learned was that he provided direct evidence against the geocentric model, and he demonstrated that celestial bodies themselves were not perfect spheres. Now, what he did not demonstrate or know was that the orbits were not circular. He was still caught. So, when he said the heliocentric model is true and he published all this stuff, he still was partly really wrong. So what happened next? Well, Kepler, who liked to say science is just men thinking God's thoughts after him. He was a very pious Christian. And again, this is one of his drawings from one of his books. He actually found out that proved that the orbits were probably elliptical. And once you assume the orbits are elliptical, all the math for how the planets move started to fall into place, right? And so we knew then, at least theoretically, that answered the problem. But it wasn't actually mathematically proven. It fit the math better, but his observations did not prove it until we get to Isaac Newton. All right, and what we learned from him is that the laws of motion and gravitation unify celestial, the stars, and the terrestrial, earthly mechanics. He explained the observation of planetary motion. In fact, he proved it by accident while he was off inventing calculus at the age of 25, while he hid in the farmlands away from the plague. So this is just a diagram, not one of his diagrams, but how he proved that the orbits were elliptical. So why did I tell us this long, long story? Well, let's read what Francis Bacon said about this, and then we'll go back to the limits of empiricism. Now, in this case, we're not just talking about what limits, what science can tell us, but how these other areas can be misapplied and limit what science is doing. The human understanding of its own nature is prone to suppose the existence of more order and regularity in the world than it finds. In other words, we think everything should be perfect and fit a certain way. And though there be many things in nature which are singular and unmatched, yet it devises for them parallels and conjugates and relatives which do not exist. Hence the fiction that all celestial bodies move in perfect circles, spirals, and dragons being, except in name, utterly rejected. All right. Well, all that is to say is that we assumed perfect circles, and that was a mistake. So let's just go back and finish up here. So empiricism does tell us about the natural world, but it can't tell us everything. And the limit of science is what can be falsifiable and what can be observable and experimented on, right? When we get to history, when we get to morality and ethics and philosophy and the existence of God, empiricism becomes really limited. We don't throw it away, but these other methods become primary. That's what I want us to understand about empiricism. That is very useful to a point, and it can be bastardized by bad assumptions like perfect circles for orbits, like uniformitarian geology. Okay? All right. Let's just go one more and come in. So here's our recommended book of the week. Now, this is a book that I have not read, but I have read a lot of reviews on this book, and it looks stupendous. I'm probably going to purchase this, and we may review it in the future. And I just wanted you to read this description from the book. Science, especially naturalistic science, has come under fire of late. No longer does it command the near universal respect it once held. Oh, thank you, COVID and Fauci. From the right has come a fresh attack on Darwinism and arguments for intelligent design. True, we'll talk about that in the future. From the left, the postmodern theorists have attacked the very notion of objective truth. In the fray, Del Rach, he's the author of this book, breathes a breath of calm. Okay, then. He asks, what is science? What can it tell us? What can't it tell us? What challenges does it offer to Christian faith? How should a Christian respond? Now updated and improved. So if you want to delve deeper into the limits of science and what science can and cannot tell us, the limits of empiricism, it is a real important subject, and the demarcation of what is science and whether or not science can tell us all or everything about reality, right? Or the most important things and everything else is unimportant or unknowable, so we should ignore it, which is what a lot of skeptics like to say. All right, well, here's our long list of things to do. So I'm going to close in prayer. And then at the end, I'm just going to talk about, for those of you who are interested and want to stick around, the difficulties and challenges I have trying to do a live or other sort of video cast. All right. So I'm going to pray, and here we go. God, I thank you so much that that you have given us our intellect, that we're not bound to just have to trust what others tell us, but we're also not limited to what we can confirm, that we can find others who are trustworthy authorities that we can believe temporarily while our understanding catches up, while our reason catches up, that I don't have to limit my practice of truth to what I can first confirm, but I can drive a car without understanding how it works. I can test the car and see how it works, even if I don't understand. I can test Christianity and see how it works out for me. But also, God, when I have assumptions, I thank you so much that you can help me use reason to get away from bad thinking, to get away from false assumptions. And that as you build my intellect, I can also resist vain philosophies that point me away from what is true. Amen. All right. Well, there you go. So now I'm just going to talk about confessions. Let's go to this little slide right here. There we go. So I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and I just haven't. In the past, I'd record them, and then I didn't have time to edit them, and I didn't have time to get intro music prepared and outro music and editing out the ums and all that. And that's why I'm doing this live, because I don't want to have to edit a podcast. This is how it goes. Starting a video cast is hard. There are so many promises. If you've been on like the internet and they say, buy my course and I'll teach you how to do this. I've tried a couple of those, and like eventually they want $1,000 to $10,000. Seriously, it's just insane. And so I'm just trying to do it on my own for free, right? So here's my current process. I take an article from my blog where I've really worked hard, and it's a really good kind of concise, encapsulated idea. I make a PowerPoint presentation. I present this using StreamYard. That's this free software I'm using. The limitations of the free version is I can only broadcast to one platform at a time. So even though it allows me to broadcast to like Facebook, and a bunch of others. The free version only allows me to do one. So I just do YouTube for now until I get the hang of this. And I'm not even sure if they let me broadcast to Rumble. I have to see what services and platforms work. I like Rumble because it's basically the non-censored YouTube. And a lot of my favorite iconoclasts like Scott Adams and Dinesh D'Souza and others are over on that platform where speech is actually truly free. I don't have to worry about that on YouTube because I'm not saying anything controversial as far as I can tell. So after I present on StreamYard, I have to create a post on my blog for it and link to it. And then that gets posted on the Facebook page for my for Whole Reason. And then I go in and have to edit the notes in YouTube and like add links and things that I talked about. So that's a lot of darn work. But I still have other challenges and other, besides other platforms, like how do you add chapter breaks in here so people can go, okay, let's go to the next subject or the next section, right? I haven't figured that out yet. I'm sure there's a way to do it. How do I create provocative shorts that I can also post to TikTok or one of the other platforms or even Facebook shorts where it will get people interested and come over here? So I haven't done any of that stuff. I know there's methods for doing that, but I just decided I'm going to do the bare minimum, which is I'm going to get myself out there and just have fun and see if I can build a community of like-minded people. So that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back next Saturday at 4 o'clock when I'm going to talk about the next category of empirical method, which is the use of reason and the different ways we can use reason to secure our understanding of what is true. All right. Thank you. God bless you. And please like, subscribe, get me into double digits. I was at 9 subscribers.